My name is Anna Goodwin, and I'm the Executive Director at the History Museum of Hood River County. We at the museum are excited to share with you some of the many remarkable people in the history of Hood River County. For 10 years, the History Museum has presented Cemetery Tales as an in-person program in Idlewilde Cemetery in Hood River. However, due to the pandemic and its uncertainties, we decided to make this year's program virtual. A benefit of this is that we have been able to portray people who are not buried in Idlewilde Cemetery, which allows us to highlight the diversity of people who have called the Hood River Valley their home. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our connections with this land and its people. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many indigenous nations and communities. The majestic Columbia River Gorge in which we live rests on the traditional and ancestral village sites of the original people of the Columbia River, Salila-Wyam, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Nimiipuu, Umatilla, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, and the many other tribes who have lived along the Columbia River for millennia. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the protectors and stewards of these lands. We acknowledge the many wrongs that we have done to them and celebrate their resilience and perseverance. We are honored to be guests here.
Hello. You caught me in the act. I'm just doing my part to try to keep the place looking nice. After all, I spent a good 10 years of my life working to organize a cemetery association to ensure that this lovely resting place would be properly cared for. I can see that it has. This is my family. Here's my stone. Arlene Winchell Moore, born November 30th, 1887. But right up the road, as a matter of fact, at a place known as Bear Wallow Ranch on Willow Flat. You wouldn't know it now, but I was a scant 2.5 pounds at birth. My mother didn't think of holding me without a pillow underneath me until I was nearly a year old. This is a special place, the Hood River Valley. I feel fortunate to have been born and raised and laid to rest right here, amidst its beauty and its remarkable people.
There are a lot of tales to tell about this area, and we'd like to have a few of Hood River's own tell you a little bit about themselves. Most of the folks you're going to meet today are interred somewhere around Hood River, but not everyone got to call this their final resting place. You may have heard of the Coes, Nathaniel, Mary, and Henry, folks who came from back east in the mid-1800s to settle in this valley. It was Mary Coe who's credited with giving this place the name Hood River. Before that, it was Dog River. Not sure if this is true, but legend has it the name Dog River came from a group of stranded, starving travelers who were forced to eat dog meat. Not my cup of tea, but sometimes a person has to do what they have to do. Of all the people who will be talking to you, only Arlene Moore, whom you just met, and orchardist Ray Sato, who you'll meet in a bit, were actually born in Hood River. Most of the people who will talk to you came here because they were looking for a new life. Cap McCann came here twice. Once in 1910 when he became Hood River's first auto dealer, which didn't work out too well since there was no road for automobiles between here and Portland. After leaving for a while, he came back again in 1916 to become an orchardist. He may have even driven back over the newly completed Columbia River Highway. Jose Castilla may be a familiar name to anyone who was in Hood River between 1969 and 1989. His restaurant was one of the friendliest in town, where everyone could meet and sit down for some great food and visit with old and new friends.
That sounds a bit like our shop, Moore Electric. People stop by all the time just to visit, but sometimes to talk about more serious matters. I became known as Grandma Moore, as I was always willing to listen and help if I could. I suppose I was the best counsel some folks had. I was smart enough, certainly was well-read enough, more than the average Joe or Jolene. I suppose I owe that to my parents, Virgil Winchell and Maggie Knapp. You know, Father was the second white child born in Hood River in 1865. He was an orchardist, and he actually donated the land that became this cemetery. One memory of early life was the pleasure we all derived from bedtime reading. We children knew intimately and could repeat word for word Grimm's fairy tales before we knew the alphabet or could count to 2. We were taught to read everything that came to hand. By age 13, I figured I'd read about 1,400 books, including the Bible, cover to cover, and a slew of other books, some of which were considered unfit for children. But this family reading habit, well, it would be a distinct advantage in our schoolwork. Our mother planned that each of her children should train for a definite line of work. I was to become a doctor, my first sister a teacher, my brother a lawyer, and so on. Well, at age 16, I had completed all the schooling available in Hood River. I took an extra year to review mathematics and Latin in preparation to enter college to study medicine, when in the beginning of my 17th year, disaster struck. A flu epidemic hit the Northwest, and my family was not spared. We all fell ill. And then my 3-year-old sister Lena developed an appendicitis, was sent to the hospital in Portland. Father went with her, stayed by her bedside day and night for nearly a week, until my mother, who was worn out from her own difficult bout with the flu and her constant sleepless worry over little Lena, well, she died at home. My dear sister followed her to heaven within a day. The grief of losing both of them was almost too much to bear. Well, the money set aside for my medical education was used to pay the hospital and funeral expenses. So I stayed in Hood River and helped care for my 6 siblings. Well, until my sister Edith could take over the duties. And then I was off to Portland and I started nurses training, which started off well enough until a sprained ankle and a difficult superintendent made things simply unbearable. Plus, I was bitterly homesick for my brothers and sisters. Well, a few twists and turns of fate, and I found myself in a completely different situation. I stayed in Portland, but I started to care for my cousin's children in exchange for room and board and business school expenses. Well, this arrangement didn't last long. My father wasn't too pleased with this decision that I had made without his consent, but I managed to finish the 2-year business training in a mere 10 months, and I was immediately placed in employment at the Aurora State Bank in Portland as a bookkeeper and assistant cashier. Well, this new life of an independent working woman only lasted about a year, and then Father asked me to return to Hood River to find work here. He needed help once again with my siblings. You see, my sister, she was eager to start her own college career. So I returned to Hood River and my family. And that's when I met my future husband, Max Moore. I wasn't so sure about him at first. He was a pocket edition of a man, not really my type. I even tried to marry him off to several of my girlfriends who were more nearly his size, but finally I accepted his proposal, only after he agreed to let me continue working after we were married, which was in July 1913. Max went to work straight away on the construction of the Condit Dam up on the White Salmon River, and within a few years after the Great War, World War I, we started our own business, Moore Electric, a wiring and battery repair shop on number 9 Oak Street. You know, I don't think our building is still there, though I imagine a lot has changed downtown since we've been gone. I wonder what Max would think about them removing the dam after all the hard work that went into building it. Well, change is inevitable. Heaven knows we had our share of change and hard times. When the Butler Bank building failed in 1932, our business felt the extreme crimp of the Depression. I worked the fruit harvest in addition to keeping the shop running just to keep our 2 daughters in high school. By 1940, we were nearly on the verge of bankruptcy ourselves, but somehow we held on, made it through, and I learned a lot about the importance of community. Having grown up in the valley, I knew a lot about the history of the different families that had settled here. So I was rightly appalled at the way our neighbors of Japanese ancestry were treated during World War II. The Nikkei family's homes and lands were taken away from them, and they were sent to prison camps. Oh, I know the government called them relocation camps, but my goodness, they were surrounded by fences and armed guards. The populace was literally scared pink. There were some who believed that the few thousand Japanese that lived among the 130 or more millions of us were some sort of supermen, capable of moving about unseen and committing acts of sabotage without getting caught in the act. When the American Legion Hall downtown Hood River painted out the names of our Japanese American servicemen from their wall of honor, well, I was incensed. And Hood River became known all across the country for the wrong reasons. In 1945, I was among 50-plus fellow citizens who, along with the Reverend Sherman Burgoyne, showed our support for the Hood River Valley Nikkei by forming the League for Liberty and Justice. Our aim was to counter the intense anti-Japanese propaganda and unreasonable prejudice. The League members would meet returning servicemen at the train depot and drive them to their homes. We would do their shopping at businesses that refused them service. We even drove their produce trucks to warehouses who refused to accept their fruit. In 1947, I wrote a letter to the editor. Some Legionnaires still insist they were right. Most would like to forget it ever occurred. The many GIs entering the Legion will, in time, swing sentiment in the right direction. Certainly a man cannot serve side by side with another man day after day, sharing the same risks and the same rations, often owing his life to that individual, and continue to think of him as unfit for Peacetime Association. I could tell there was still a long road to travel before this anti-racial canker would be eliminated from the American way of life. So I focused my time and energy on helping my neighbors, especially those who face discrimination. In so doing, I became a trusted friend of the Celilo people. Some of them would come into the shop and ask for Grandma Moore's help in understanding these legal documents they were receiving from the government. This was just before the Dalles Dam was completed, and there was a lot of concern about what would happen once Celilo Falls was gone. I saw a lot of change in my 81 years, and I always felt it was very important to preserve and share the history of this place and its people. So I helped get started the very first historical society, which later became the Hood River History Museum. Hopefully these stories will still be around for generations to come. It is so nice to see all these folks at peace next to each other. My husband Max passed away 1 year after I did in 1970, and he lies next to me here at the Pine Grove Butte Cemetery, alongside my parents and my siblings, and my daughter, Barbara Wygant. My other daughter is laid to rest up at Idlewilde Cemetery, you know, on the Heights? Did you know the Heights was mostly farmland in the early days? This would have been before Hood River was even a town. Well, it sure has grown in size and community. Now, when the Coe family moved to Dog River, there was nothing. I mean, there were a lot of natives, and by a lot, I mean not as many as there used to be, but still.
It's interesting how quickly what some would call civilization came to the Oregon Territory. You should know that people have been living here for tens of thousands of years. By the time Europeans were exploring the world in the 16th century, Oregon was already home to many Native Americans. For the next 250 years, European explorers came at first, primarily by sea, in many cases seeking the Northwest Passage. And later they came over land but missed many of the most beautiful areas in Oregon. Lewis and Clark traveled through the region in 1806 during their expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And only 4 years later, in 1810, the Astor expedition brought fur traders to the future site of Astoria by both land and sea. Fort Astoria was the first permanent white settlement in the region, and thus began an era of exploitation by fur traders and trappers. The natives generally welcomed the arrival of Europeans in the 19th century, partly for the increased trading opportunities. However, the introduction of foreign diseases would prove devastating to local populations. Natives and settlers from the East also had very different ideas about land ownership and personal rights. As Americans moved west looking for new opportunities, they found them, often at the expense of Native people who already lived on the land, but in some cases with mutual respect and economic interest.
I was grateful for the help of Native peoples. I couldn't have done my job without it. My name is Nathaniel Coe. In 1851, when I was 63 years of age, I was appointed postal agent for the Northwest Oregon Territory, which stretched all the way from the Canadian border to Northern California and everything west from the Rocky Mountain Continental Divide to the Pacific Ocean. I was on the trail a good bit. Having been given this trust, I was plunged into the wilderness where, to me, the rights of Native peoples were unquestioned. I didn't hesitate. I arrived in Oregon in 1852 with my 15-year-old son, Eugene. We established a post office above the Willamette Falls on a steamboat named Kanama. I sorted packages and mail as the vessel moved along the river, and we stopped at landings along the way to deliver and pick up the mail. The Kanama made 2 round trips weekly in those days, from the town of Kanama, which is now part of Oregon City, to Salem. Mail delivery was fairly casual in those days. People would just come down to the landing and wave a letter to flag us down. It was glorious times there above the Willamette Falls. They made steamboats there, too. In those days, steamers were fueled by wood. A steamer could burn 4 cords of wood in an hour. We had to make many stops along the way. I also rode native trails on horseback to establish post offices and mail contracts. I went all the way north to Olympia and south to Rogue River. I endured hardships, to be sure, but it was worth it. After a year, I was so pleased with this country that I sent for my family back in Western New York, where I had, as a younger man, been a successful lawyer and state legislator.
On December 12th, 1853, my mother and I, with my brothers, Charles and Lawrence, embarked from New York on the sidewheel steamer Georgia and arrived 8 days later at the Isthmus of Panama. I was 9 years old at the time, and I vividly remember being carried on the back of a local guide across Panama. After illness and a stormy voyage, our father welcomed us in Portland in January of 1854 to the land of promise.
When they arrived, we were entertained at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas J. Dreyer. He was the founder and editor of the Oregonian. My reunited family and I spent several months in Portland looking for an appropriate place to settle. At first, we had our eyes on 800 acres of property on the east side of the Willamette, across from the city, but the wild beauty, the grandeur of the Columbia River Gorge won us over, and we soon found ourselves at the mouth of the Dog River.
We placed an order for lumber from Mr. Bradford's mill at the Cascades.
You noticed Cascade Locks.
Yes, dear. The purpose of the lumber was to build a store in that tiny hamlet. And then, in the spring of 1854, we made the most delightful journey up the Columbia River. The first night, we were entertained by Mr. Bradford's brother-in-law. The next day, we portaged past the Cascades and reached Dog River about noon. We disembarked to conduct a brief land survey. We were enthralled by what we saw. We continued up to the Dalles, overnighted there, and headed back downriver the next day. A hard wind forced us to land on the north shore at White Salmon. There, E.S. Joslin, the only settler between the Cascades and the Dalles, greeted us with true pioneer hospitality. He invited everyone, the passengers, the crew, and the captain, to his home for the night. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but we were all in agreement that Dog River was the fairest spot on earth.
In June, a second party composed of my son Eugene, William Jenkins, Nathan Benson, and myself returned to Dog River and did a careful survey of the whole country, with the result that Jenkins sent for his wife and his brother-in-law, James Benson. I had wood delivered up, and we all started in earnest in establishing our claims.
We weren't the first settlers to try and make a go of it at Dog River, but we were the first and most successful land granters. The men got to work and built a 20 by 40 foot house, which henceforth was known as the Coe home. Mr. Jenkins took the Farnsworth place, and that already had a good house on it. Nathan Benson decided to settle and homestead just across the Dog River from us on the east side. Henry and I arrived at our new home in September.
My mother found the name Dog River distasteful and somehow managed to convince everyone it should forever be called Hood River.
I don't know why it just wasn't called Coville or Coe City.
Oh, Father, stop!
For 2 years, we lived abundantly. We brought in stock animals, we planted vegetables and grain, and it was a perfect place to grow apple trees. Improvements on the farm were made rapidly.
But trouble was approaching. From the north, the south, and the east, the Native Americans rose up to drive the white man from their country. I was just a child in the Hood River Valley at the time, but we had made plenty of friends with the native people. A friendly Klickitat Indian by the name of Sapotiwell came across the Columbia River to the north to warn our friends, the Joslins, of the impending trouble. Soon after, their hired man, Mr. Galantine, was also warned of an imminent attack. He just had time to reach the house, secure his gun, and with a visiting boy, Samuel, escape into the shelter of the willows near the shore. He made it just as the Indians arrived. By morning, they stood on a point of land opposite Mosier and hailed a boat coming down from Fort Dalles and were landed at the Coe home.
Mrs. Joslin had heard about the flight and came up from the Cascades to fetch the boy. All day, we could see Native Americans riding single file along the trail above the White Salmon River. We watched and wondered anxiously what it could mean. Later that day, Mrs. Joslin saw smoke rising from across the river. It turned out the Klickitat Indians had set fire to her house.
Hasty preparations were made for our departure from Hood River. A large canoe belonging to an old Indian by the name of Wauchusha was secured and hid in the underbrush near what is now the foot of State Street. This canoe was large enough to hold 30 or 40 people, but the entire white settlement consisted only of 14 souls. Nathan and James Benson, Mr. Jenkins and his wife, mother and father, and us 4 boys, and the Joslins, and the man Galantine, and the boy Samuel from the Joslin farm. We had to paddle hard to go upstream, and we put up a blanket for a sail, but the wind was from the east, so that didn't work. Our progress was extremely slow, and long before daylight, we could hear the Indians on shore signaling back and forth. We were caught. Our flight had been discovered.
But much to our relief, at the mouth of the Klickitat River, we came upon the steamers Mary and Wasco with a barge in tow, loaded with soldiers and horses and cannons. I can still remember the valiant blue of the soldiers' coats and the sun glistening off their bayonets. It raised our spirits, and we were able to push on and arrive in the Dalles about noon.
2 days later, we returned to Hood River. We were happy to have some of the soldiers stay with us for a while. We quickly got back to work and made a grand success of the homestead. Potatoes, peaches, apples, plums, pears, pork. Why, we produced so much that we kept 2 hired men busy on $30 a month in season.
And we also hired Native Americans when we were doing big projects, and always had someone to help us with the kitchen.
Father was the mastermind, overseeing and directing. Eugene handled most of the marketing. I came in for the lion's share hardship, handling and herding the stock. For 16 years, the farm work passed on with the same precision and vigor and success. Father passed October 17th, 1868. It was a day of sadness for those of us who had for many years looked up to him for guidance and love. He was buried on a little plot of land set aside for that purpose on the Coe farm. Many friends from Portland and the Dalles came to pay their last tribute of love to their departed friend.
The next spring, Henry and Eugene and their wives moved to Yakima to engage in raising livestock. Charles stayed to run the farm. And then, in 1872, Charles took ill, and despite all that was done for him, he succumbed and died on December 24th, his birthday, only 38 years old.
Eugene and I moved back to Hood River and formed a partnership with Mother on the farm.
Yes, and the arrival of the railroad brought new opportunities to all of us at the Columbia Gorge. I am especially proud that my son Henry platted the town of Hood River in 1881.
Mother, it consisted of 4 blocks then. Clearly it had to grow over the years.
Yes, and today it's a lovely town of almost 8,000. All my life, I enjoyed writing poetry. And of course, my grandchildren brought much happiness to me. Often, I wrote poems about them or dedicated my poems to them. I lived to be almost 92 years old and laid my head down for the last time in Hood River on January 21st, 1893.
Henry Coe was educated at Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon, entering when he was 19. Later in his life, he went to work on ships on the Columbia River. He went from deckhand to master and filled every position in between. It resulted in him knowing the business thoroughly. He took out master's papers in 1877 and was on the river more or less from the time he first started. In charge of some of the largest boats plying the river, as a riverboat captain, he rubbed elbows with all kinds and classes of people. It gave him an understanding of people and a certain know-how to deal with the numerous problems that are part of commercial life. A successful capitalist, he became one of the best-known men in Oregon. From the earliest days, he was closely identified with the development of the Northwest and was active and aggressive, resulting in some of its most important improvements. His labors and those of his brothers cannot be separated from the opening of the territory. Their efforts are part and parcel of the history of the Inland Empire and the country itself. Henry passed away at his home in Manhattan Beach, California, December 4th, 1928. He asked to be cremated and have his ashes spread over Hood River.
My father and our family arrived in Hood River in 1869, not long after Mr. Nathaniel Coe's passing. But I didn't know much of that story, probably because we didn't live here long, and also schooling wasn't available to colored children.
My name is Reuben Crawford, and this here is my firstborn, Harriet, but we call her Hattie. In addition to Hattie, we had several other children: William, Cupid, Susan, Francis, he passed away as an infant, and Mary, who was born here in Hood River. We had other children, but they was taken away from us when we were slaves. I was born a slave in Missouri in 1827. By the age of 13, I was sent off to St. Louis to learn the art of ship caulking. That's making wooden ships watertight. It's a difficult job, and not many folks can do it well, but I was good at it. And during the Civil War, I earned enough money to earn freedom passes for myself and my wife Lavinia for about $500 apiece. Well, that'd be over $4,500 in today's money. During the war, I worked on the ironclad ships like the Monitor. The Union Navy used them to win the war that ended slavery.
At the start of the 20th century, colored Portlanders had built a small but well-established community of several thousand. Despite racist laws that prohibited colored people from residing in Oregon, colored families built lives on what is now Old Chinatown and the Pearl District, and along Williams and Vancouver Boulevards. Clubs and churches formed the social bedrock of the community, bringing people together to take care of each other and to listen to speakers advocating for the pressing issues of the day.
Oregon was an especially hard place for a colored man. They had lash laws that forbade me from owning property or even being a resident of the state. The law was written in 1844 and authorized punishment for any black settler in the territory to be lashed every 6 months until they left.
Indeed. It was an awful time in Oregon's history. Though the law wasn't enforced often, it read that they would receive upon his or her bare back not less than 20, nor more than 39 stripes, to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county.
I didn't know that when we moved to Oregon in 1869 at the behest of Mr. Michael Nye.
As we've heard, in Hood River, the first Homestead Act holdings were by Nathaniel Coe and his brother-in-law, William Jenkins. While Coe retained his holdings for quite some time, the Jenkins family suffered an early tragedy. On May 15, 1864, William Jenkins and his son drowned trying to transfer cargo between boats at the mouth of the Hood River. Consequently, the land claim fell to Jenkins' widow, Phila, who after 5 years was unable to manage the 320 acres and sold the property to Michael Nye and his son-in-law, Dr. B.W. Mitchell, for $2,800. The Jenkins, now Nye Mitchell land claim rounds south from the Columbia River along present-day 13th Street to Belmont Road and then west along Belmont, where it turns north again.
You know, I was a shipman, and when it came time to go west, we didn't go by the Oregon Trail. We went up to New York and caught a ship that took us down through the Isthmus of Panama, and then we caught another ship that took us to California, where we met up with my wife's mother and father, Cupid and Susan Blue. In that way, we came west pretty much well like the Coles.
Papa wasn't planning to come to Oregon, and we all were happy living with Mama's family in California.
We were church-going folk, and we had problems with what you might call a renegade pastor. The man tried to swallow the keys to the church, and I took action in the only way I knew how, by putting my hands around his neck. And for my efforts, I was ordered to appear in court.
My grandpa Cupid knew Mr. Nye, and we all thought we could solve his problem of needing workers on his homestead.
Heading up north helped me avoid a difficult situation in California. And although we weren't the first colored folks to pass through the territory, we were the first colored residents of Hood River.
When the Crawfords arrived in Oregon in 1869, the latest and most restrictive of Oregon's black exclusion laws had been ratified just over a decade earlier in 1857. The measure expressly forbade black people from settling or voting in the state, making contracts, owning real estate, or even being under anyone's employment. The exclusion laws were not closely enforced, though, and having a sponsor definitely helped when the Nyes underwrote the Crawfords' move. An interesting thing about Oregon was that it was both anti-slavery and pro-exclusion.
I was 6 at the time of the move out west, and probably am the only Crawford child to remember living in Hood River. Both our parents worked, so I tended to my younger siblings.
An encyclopedia of the region at that time claimed that although Meriwether Lewis's servant York was the first African American to pass through the Hood River area in 1805, the distinction of being the first African American residents goes to the Crawford family of Missouri. Mrs. Nye died in 1870, and Dr. Mitchell became very ill and died in 1872. While Mr. Nye lived a long life and eventually died in Prineville, and Dr. Mitchell's wife Naomi Nye Mitchell remarried and lived a long life in the Dalles, illness and death undid the partnership, and it was sold in 1870, likely prompting the Crawfords to move on to Portland, where Reuben was able to get work at the shipyards.
My siblings and I attended the Portland Colored School in a small house on the corner of 4th and Columbia Avenue, nearly a mile from our home. When the school was established in 1867, 21 colored children were enrolled and taught by a single teacher. When the school closed due to the integration of Oregon schools in 1872, 30 children were enrolled.
After a year or so working odd jobs at the dock, I got a job as a ship caulker. My skills brought me local fame and steady work. Toward the end, the Oregonian described me as the best-known ship caulker on the West Coast. I became more involved in local politics and community organizing. I served as secretary for the Portland Colored Immigration Society around 1879. I eventually held high office in the Integrated Caulkers Union, where I fought for the rights of equal pay for colored workers. I was in newspapers every so often when I gave speeches at the annual Emancipation Ball and at the Lincoln Club. I was a member of the Odd Fellows, and I was one of the founders of the Mount Olivet Baptist Church on what is now Northwest Broadway and Everett in Portland.
As a child, I often accompanied my father to these meetings. As I grew older, I became involved in women's auxiliaries of several social and fraternal organizations. These organizations gave me the opportunity to engage with the community of civically minded colored women. We discussed issues like suffrage and temperance and mounted campaigns to elevate these to the public forum. In Portland, not only was I able to gain a better education, but through participation in church communities, I was able to gain the speaking and organizing skills I needed to advocate for the causes I cared about. I'm very proud of being one of Oregon's first suffragists. In fact, I was recently honored by Oregon State University, who renamed a building for me, the Hattie Redmond Women and Gender Center. In November of 1892, I married Emerson Redmond, then a waiter at the Portland Hotel.
They were married by the Reverend T. Brown at our home at 287 Grant Street. Unfortunately, that marriage was tumultuous.
Oh, Papa, I did remain married to Mr. Redmond until his death in 1907, but we were not husband and wife. Now, I may not have attained the professional reputation that you enjoyed, but I made sure to continue your legacy of advocacy for colored Portlanders. For many politically active women at the time, the issues of temperance and suffrage were the twin pillars of feminism and social reform. In the 1890s, I split my energy fairly equally between the two. By 1912, some other activists and myself became less certain that total abstinence was a feasible goal, so we cut our ties with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. We reformed as the Colored Women's Council and focused our energies on the broader needs of the poor and unfortunate women of our community. I served as a secretary and spokesperson from the very beginning. A lot of us saw suffrage as the most pressing issue of the time. And despite low turnout at some of our earlier meetings and regular defeat in the polls, our push for suffrage gained gradual acceptance with the help of our colored churches and community leaders.
Her meetings at Mount Olivet Baptist Church sometimes drew curious men and husbands along with the women who regularly attended.
I am very proud that after decades of advocacy, women's suffrage was ratified in Oregon by male voters. I registered as soon as I could to vote in April of 1913.
Her life after 1913 was full and purposeful. In 1914, she was elected vice president of the state's first colored women's Republican club. She hosted regular luncheons at Mount Olivet Baptist Church until at least 1923, and she also taught Sunday school. On February 29th, 1924, she gave a speech on Booker T. Washington, just like my annual emancipation speeches. I wasn't there, I had passed on by then, but I am so proud of my girl.
Reuben Crawford was called the Dean of Shipbuilders and given the privilege of christening 2 new vessels. He worked until the age of 81 and died 10 years later in 1918. Hattie was an excellent organizer, an articulate public speaker, and despite being well educated, the best job she could find was as a janitor at the federal courthouse for 29 years. This was fairly common in the black community in Portland at that time. Hattie had no children, so her story and that of the Crawfords was mainly lost until recently. She continued to be a driving force for women of color in Oregon until her death from bronchial pneumonia on June 27, 1952, at the age of 90. Around the same time Hattie was fighting for women's suffrage in Portland, 2 men with very different backgrounds were moving to Hood River to make their mark on the valley as orchardists.
Well, you know, originally I didn't plan to be an orchardist in Hood River, but ultimately I found it to be rewarding and gave me the opportunity to help some of my friends during and after World War II. I'm Charles Patterson McCann. Came into this world April 17, 1887 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and departed December 19, 1951 in Phoenix, Arizona. Some of my friends knew me as Cap, a moniker I inherited from my riverboat captain father. But I did not follow him onto the water. Instead, I made a pretty good living in a strictly land-based mode of transportation, the automobile. And my big break came in Buffalo, New York, during the early part of the 20th century, selling cars in what was one of the biggest boom towns in America at the time. In 1910, I gave up the big city and moved to Hood River. I had plenty of money and many varied interests, and boy, did I find a way to spend it. I bought 13 acres, most of it orchard, for $17,000 from Lee Smith for my country home. It's still there, owned by the Charles M. Shepard family of Shepard Equipment, and it still goes by the name the McCann House. It was designed by a San Francisco architect named Albert Sutton, and he was living deep in the West Hills of the Valley with his twin daughters because of a custody fight. Those two girls were never without a bodyguard. He also designed the Oak Grove Schoolhouse. I paid $30,000 for the 20-acre Heilbronner property adjacent to my original purchase, and I imported a Logier touring car, not unlike this beauty, many of which are right here at Wham. That's WAAAM in Hood River. And then I built a racetrack and filled my barns with thoroughbreds, including the famous trotter, the Bondsman. I paid $11,000 for that fine thoroughbred and immediately put him out to stud. I guess I was interested in every form of transportation, so I bought myself a Farman biplane and built a landing strip right next to my tip-top ranch. My house cost in the neighborhood of $10,000. And it was a beautiful New England colonial style with magnificent French windows, a large living room and dining room with a fireplace and a spiral staircase going up to the second story, and crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceilings. I brought in the most modern equipment for the kitchen and the bath. And the floors were Scottish tiles, and the walls were tiled too. And the doors and trim and cupboards were opaline glass, a construction material used in hospitals, with hardwood floors and plate glass windows and a full basement with a hot water heating plant. Some say my masterstroke in that house was commissioning hand-painted murals that filled the upper 6 feet in the main room. It was the first paid work of the young Herman Struck, whom I knew in his Paris art days. I paid him $200. I had no interest in fruit growing, so I ripped out those 13 acres of apples to build my racetrack and stock my barns with the finest horses I could buy. And besides horses, I also had purebred collies and cats and and a Jersey cow from Jersey, of course. A friend of mine described it as a lath structure with a cowhide draped over it. Those animals, well, they wandered everywhere, much to the despair of some of my neighbors. East of the large barns, I built a garage for my Logier, my Maxwell Auto Agency, and private stalls for the cars I sold to friends. Now, by that time, my house had become the center of Hood River high society. Life was a lark, as well it should be. And Hood River was my toy shop. I'd buy whatever appealed to me, play with it a while, and then find a new toy. And I strutted the local scene for nearly 3 years and lived extravagantly and with gusto, the way a roguish, handsome young man should. Now, you may have heard of Sam Hill and his interest in cars, or more specifically, roads for cars. Well, Sam was a friend of mine, and he was a true visionary. His dream was to build a highway from Portland through the gorge all the way out to the Dalles. Unfortunately, Sam didn't work fast enough for me and my cars. In 1912, I had a run of what you might call bad luck. A blizzard hit Hood River in January, and the roof of my garage collapsed, destroying the cars of some of the town's wealthiest citizens. I decided to head west to Forest Grove and to jump on a new opportunity. As I mentioned, cars weren't my only love, and the lawsuits piling up kind of soured me on them. So I bought the premier horse ranch near Rainier, and I purchased the harness racing track in Portland and snatched up the racetrack in Forest Grove. Well, then I bought out my partners in Portland and made plans to make Forest Grove the racing capital of the West Coast. And, well, it looked like my dream was coming true for a while. The Oregon Electric Railroad built a stop right at the racetrack in Forest Grove. And soon, racing enthusiasts from Portland and all over were at my racetrack. The result? Sold out. Well, but then circumstances changed. It only took 2 years of heavy rain to turn my racetrack into a mud pit. And there were all kinds of other horse tracks popping up all over the Northwest, and they were cutting into my business. I had to sell the horse ranch and my prized thoroughbreds. In 1916, I traded the Forest Grove property for an orchard in Hood River, and I returned to the Columbia River Gorge. I probably never should have left, but it turned out all right. I led a quiet life in Hood River, and I knew it was the right thing to join some of my friends in protecting the property of the Japanese who had been placed in internment camps in World War II. Well, as much as I loved Hood River and my many friends there, I spent my final years in Phoenix, where you'll see my grave. Not many people know it, but that's my house on Tucker Road, across from Mount View Cemetery, where Mr. Coe is buried.
These red Anjous are absolutely the best pears in the world. Well, that's my opinion anyway. See, I chose to grow them up here in Parkdale because they really like the cool nights. It's what gives them that deep red color. Juicy and sweet. You know they ripen from the inside out. And it's also because they're a good money-making crop. I mean, I am a businessman after all. I'm Ray Sato, and these are my orchards. My son Gordy runs the business now, and I hear it's doing well. I am so grateful because it sure was a hard climb to get it to where it is today. Yes, there were difficulties and hardships, but ultimately, I feel that I achieved my goal of assimilating in the Hood River Valley and having my work ethic be an example to my family. In the early 1900s, my father Tadao and mother Shin moved to the Hood River Valley from Nagano Prefecture in Japan. I mean, they were looking for a better life. And they started an orchard right here on 25 acres in Parkdale. Now, I was born April 3rd, 1917, by a midwife in the house that they built on the property. You know, my son Gordy still lives in that house today. I had 3 sisters, and we all helped my parents from dawn till dusk, and sometimes even after dark. In the 1940s, we expanded the orchards to 40 acres. At that time, it really did seem like America was the land of opportunity. But that all changed on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And it suddenly drew America into the war that had been raging all across the Pacific and Europe. it suddenly seemed that anyone of Japanese descent was considered an enemy. But I was born in America, so I'm a Nisei, which means second generation. But being born in America also meant that I'm an American citizen. And I just didn't even think to consider myself anything but. On May 13th, 1942, 431 Issei and Nisei were gathered at the Hood River train station, where we were removed to an internment camp in Pinedale, California. 431. That was the entire Japanese population of Hood River. Luckily for us, our neighbor John Cooper watched our farm while we were away. Most lost everything, and some never returned. We were fortunate. After arriving in Pinedale, we didn't want to do anything. It was hot, dusty, and monotonous. It got to be work even to eat or sleep. I know, it sounds odd, but it was an odd existence. I missed fishing and hiking and watching fruit grow, or even riding in a car. I never knew how much love I had for the Hood River Valley until we were away. You know, Parkdale and Pinedale sound so similar, but in reality they were so different. Worlds apart. I mean, I did feel lucky. I got a job as a head timekeeper for a group of workers. The pay was meager. $8 a month for unskilled workers, $12 a month for skilled, and then $16 for professionals like me. I was just happy that I had an office job and didn't have to work outside in the hot sun. By the end of the first month, our camp was already filled to its 5,000 person capacity. I had never seen so many Japanese in my life. There was already a lot of prejudice and misunderstanding about the Issei all along the West Coast even before the war. I mean, our parents didn't speak English very well, and it was hard for them to build bridges or break down barriers. They struggled to make a living, but their work ethic and desire to succeed despite the difficulties bore excellent fruit, literally. But that led to misunderstanding and envy from our neighbors. This hysteria is something that cannot be explained. But in war times, minds are manipulated and people change the way they think. After Pinedale, my family and I were moved to Tule Lake, just south of Klamath Falls in Northern California, where we were again watched by armed guards. In 1943, I was allowed to move to Cleveland, Ohio, where I got a job as a mechanic for the Yellow Cab Company. You know, it was there that I started to feel like an American again. But that would change. In 1945, the war had ended, and my friends Sat Noji, Min Asai, and I decided to move back to Hood River. When we saw that our little town had made national news, it seemed that 16 Japanese American servicemen had their names removed from a downtown war memorial. The headlines in the Hood River News said that there would be a welcoming party waiting there for us when we got to the train station. But luckily, when we arrived at the Hood River train depot, they had failed to show. Now the three of us stayed together, fearing for our lives. And we hid in the basement of my parents' house. When we did venture out, we were kept under the watchful eye of Mr. Clyde Linville, a big, soft-spoken guy who was hired by the government to watch over us. You know, if it wasn't for the kind-heartedness of people like John Cooper, who watched our place while we were away, we wouldn't have had a place to come back home to. It is hard to believe that this could happen in America, but it did. The first person to extend a hand to me, literally, was a person who I'd never even met, Mrs. Doris Burgoyne. Her husband, Reverend Sherman Burgoyne, along with Arlene Moore, who I've heard you've already met, started the League for Liberty and Justice. Their goal was to counter the Valley's intolerance and to welcome back the returning Japanese Americans. I went to the bank where Doris worked and was surprised when she got up from her desk and walked towards me with her hand extended, literally welcoming me back to the community. But I could tell she was mostly alone in her sentiment. I could see the disappointed looks. And I heard that she had to quit her job because of differing views. You know, the residents even threw a rock through the Burgoyne's parsonage window, and they ostracized them to the point where they couldn't even sell their fruit. They had to sell their farm with the pears still on the tree. For a while, it was difficult to get groceries or even shop in Hood River. Mr. McIsaac's store in Parkdale was one of the few places that would sell to us. This one time, Mr. McIsaac told these race haters to go buy their groceries somewhere else. They really did not like that. Later, I had the opportunity to pay back some of that goodwill to Mr. McIsaac when his store burned down. I was able to invest and help build him a new one. Gradually, I began to feel the Hood River Valley filling my heart with joy again. You know, farming was always one of my greatest loves. I graduated from Oregon State University in 1939 with a degree in horticulture. In the 1950s, I kept adding land and family. I married Dorothy Suguro on February 12, 1950 at the Parkdale Community Church. A snowstorm delayed our wedding once, but we were sure happy when the weather cleared. We had 3 children, Peggy, Sally, and Gordy, and they all liked the city life more than they liked the farm life. But in 1995, my son Gordy returned to the farm. I told everybody in town, "Hey, Gordy's coming back." Now, he admitted to not knowing much about farming or being mechanically inclined, but for the next 7 or 8 years, he spent 24/7 here on the farm learning the business. In fact, he even learned Spanish so he could better communicate with the workers. He started this tradition of having an end-of-season fiesta for all the workers, which proved what I always said: Gordy sure knows how to throw a good party. And as it turns out, he knows a thing or two about being an orchardist. One of the big changes I brought to the orchard was that I took out all the apple trees and planted all pears. My favorites, as you've already heard, are red Anjous. I was one of the first to bring them to this valley. In 1965, I was named Orchardist of the Year by the Hood River Chamber of Commerce. I had finally achieved my goal of becoming an honorable American citizen with a strong work ethic. I hope I pass that down to my kids, along with my love of the outdoors. I was an avid fisherman.
Hey, I love fishing too.
You'll get your turn. I love fishing, hunting, trap shooting. I even climbed Mount Hood twice. More than anything, I wanted to be known as a man who could make the best out of any situation and live with whatever I was dealt. I grew the business, I lived a good life, and I passed down my love of fruit growing to my son, just like my father did to me. And I was honored to be one of the first Japanese Americans to be asked to join the Elks and the Masons. And I loved bowling for the McIsaac store. Everything I did was what I thought it was to be an American. But most of all, I learned the importance of treating other people like you would like to be treated. My son Gordy obviously feels the same way. Okay, Jose, let's talk fishing.
There's nothing I love more than fishing. Except my family.
Family and fishing, 2 of life's greatest pleasures.
I remember packing up my 1977 Dodge van and going on family fishing trips.
Me too. Oregon rivers are some of the best places in the world to drop a line.
I love river fishing too. But even more than that, I love going to the Newport Jetty to fish. I think everyone should be passionate about fishing. And good food too. That's why I opened Jose's Taco House on Cascade Avenue. I believe it's Fall River now. Wow, it's crazy the changes Hood River has made.
Oh, tell me about it.
Por supuesto. Me llamo Jose Castilla. I was born on November 26, 1922 in Breckenridge, Texas. My family moved to Piedras Negras in Mexico when I was a kid. And when I grew older, I moved back to the States to live and work. When I was 24, I met and married the love of my life, Maria Luisa Guitan, in 1946. Even though we were American citizens, those early years were hard. We moved around a lot, doing many jobs. You know, in the 1940s and 50s, many people were prejudiced, even in the West. Latinos were the first to settle in the West long before European Americans did, but it didn't take long for us to be looked down on.
Jose, you know we had a good life here, especially when we got to Hood River. I like looking at the positive side of things.
Ay, sí, mi amor. I was just thinking of some of the things Señor Sato was saying, and it got me thinking about all the challenges we've faced in our lives.
Oh, I remember the poor pay and housing when we were migrant workers. And we lived all over the country, Ohio, Colorado, Michigan. And we had a great family. Hilda, Joe, Sophia, Carol, Albert, Ana Luisa, Elizabeth, and 34 grandchildren, and 31 great-grandchildren. Our family is everything to us. My worst fear is something bad will happen to our kids or grandkids. Before they leave, I always tell them, "Come, let me give you a blessing."
And it would make you very angry if someone would hurt our family. Remember that one time you made me drive to the high school because some teacher called our daughter and Gracie Dominguez a taco vendor?
Yes, like Gracie, who was always defending our girls at school. I wouldn't take that from anyone. I marched up to that teacher who seemed like he was 7 feet tall.
Even though you are 4'11", tienes juego en tu corazón. I waited in the car.
I told him she was not a taco vendor. She was not stupid. She was smart. If he couldn't teach her, then move her to a class she could be taught in.
Sure, we had some bad moments, but I loved our life in Hood River. It was full of beautiful people who came to appreciate our good food and our friendliness to anyone who came to our restaurant.
But you did more than that. You worked at the courthouse and the jail interpreting for people, and you didn't even get paid for that.
I truly believe that you should help out anyone when you can. We were one of the first Latino families to settle in Hood River, along with the Dominguez and Ortega family. Seems like everybody else came for the harvest work and then left back to Mexico, or looked for more harvest work. Our restaurant opened in 1969.
Jose's Taco House was the first Mexican restaurant in Hood River. We were an employment office, a welfare office, a homeless shelter. I can't remember a time that we didn't have someone staying with us. Mi amor, you have such a big heart. You knew everyone in the community and everybody knew you.
Probably because of the good food. I mean, where else are you gonna get Tejano-style enchiladas and rice and beans? Baby, you were the best cook.
I remember we had truckers that stopped in all the time, and that one immigration officer that was coming in from a raid in Spokane, he was dressed in uniform and spoke Spanish well. Yeah, he was complaining about nuns yelling at him to go away.
I told him, you shouldn't wear that uniform everywhere. Not everybody likes you.
Jose Castilla's Taco House was a community meeting place. We had an open door policy. If you needed a meal, you got a meal. Everyone deserved to eat. We wanted it to be a safe haven for the community. And our children carry on that tradition of family, love, and kindness.
You made it into more than a restaurant, though. It was a mercado. Remember that fish tank that we had tipped over to display the music? Yeah, we had herbal medication and canned goods.
Oh yes, and we would go to Mexico like once or twice a year for, during school breaks, and we would get Mojave canned goods and piñatas.
By the way, everybody worked at the restaurant. Our grandchildren, our children. It was a family place.
Our granddaughter Mandy, she would go to the back and sleep on a sack of beans.
You would say, "Where is she? Where is she? Oh my God, they kidnapped her. Jose Castilla, you go find her." She'd be around the back, sound asleep.
I love my babies. I taught them to do no wrong, how to have faith in God, self-sufficiency. If you wanted something, you work hard for it. More than anything, I wanted them to know that love of family was important, and that family can be many people. It doesn't have to be your blood. It wasn't just that you were born into the family, you're accepted into the family. I love family. I love humanity. I would say, mija, you never know anybody's story. You could be the first person that they talk to today. what will you contribute to their life? Will you be a blessing or will you be a burden?
I love the way that you find beauty in everything. And whenever I went fishing on the jetty, you'd be walking on the beach, just looking at rocks, and you would say, look at this one. Look how pretty.
Well, I love that you kept one eye on the pole and the other one on the kids climbing the rocks, except that one time that you caught this really big fish and it nearly dragged you into the ocean.
I almost landed it, but Joe cut the line.
And Albert caught you, so you didn't fall in.
It was wonderful to have this great large family. I mean, everyone pitched in. Grandkids were bussing and setting tables. Kids were taking orders. Holidays were all spent together, either at the restaurant or at home.
For holidays, we'd go to Tia's house and we'd set up tables in the living room where people congregate. As usual in a Latino family, guys were outside, ladies inside, and kids were all over. We all cooked, potluck style. Mucho gusto.
Amo mi familia. But eventually, everything had to come to an end. Jose's taco house closed in 1988 and became Montero's. And Maria, the love of my life, passed away on February 13th, 1994. And when I was surrounded by family, I passed away on Sunday, June 29th, 2009.
Thank you for joining us for this year's Cemetery Tales. I hope that you come away with an understanding of how the Hood River Valley became the multifaceted community that it is today. I would like to thank everyone for making Cemetery Tales such a success this year. In particular, I'd like to thank Joe Garut, Michael Friend, Erica Roulier, Matt Rankin, and the entire Cemetery Tales committee. I'd also like to acknowledge the cast and crew, without which we would not have a performance at all. Everyone has a passion for history, and that's reflected in this unforgettable version of Cemetery Tales. I would also like to thank our sponsors for their generosity in supporting the museum and this event. Last but not least, I'd like to encourage all of you to come visit the museum. Consider volunteering or becoming a member. Your support is what allows us to do programs like this. This is your museum, and I hope to see you here soon. Thank you for joining us for this year's Cemetery Tales. I hope that you come away with a better understanding of how the Hood River Valley became the multifaceted, You're welcome. That's going on the blooper reel.
Yep.
Sorry.
I love my babies. I taught them to do no wrong. No.
I guess my most famous touch was, I'm lost.
I have to redo that.
Remember that one time when we were... Nope. We weren't in high school. I was like, remember that one time we were in high school? Okay.
More volume. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with that. I don't usually.
An old Indian by the name of Wauchusha was secured and hid in the underbrush near what is now the foot of State Street. Yeah, this was blowing towards me. I was wondering if it changed the shadow at all or anything.
So I built a large garage and rented spaces to them. I'm lost.
My papa went with her, of course, stayed by her bedside day and night, and for nearly a week, Why do I just keep adding words and adding words? God, you think you're, I've got this. I can just say whatever.
I wasn't there. I had passed on by then, but I am so proud of my girl.
Boom! Bam!